Welcome back. Hope everybody had a good break. I know some people are still filtering in from the lunch, so we are headed into the afternoon.
Yes.
In a conversation.
Afternoon, not for our guests.
True, not for everyone.
So I am very happy to welcome our new guest, who is a great star. We will speak with her about the science of change, and before I will introduce Julia Dar in a second, we will have a time to know two things. First, it will be a 20-minute conversation, and you will have, as Julia was kind enough to be live from Boston, you will have a 10-minute Q&A with her. So I will introduce Julia, and in a minute, Ted will start the conversation. Good morning, Julia.
Good morning, good afternoon, Eric, my friend, hello. Good afternoon, everyone live there. It's nice to be with you today.
Good to see you.
So great. So Julia is the global leader of behavioral science at Boston Consulting Group, founding and co-leading BCGs Behavioral Science Lab and the firm's Behavioral Science Network. She is also a member of BCG's Global Change Management Leadership Team and is the leader that drive innovation at the intersection of behavioral and organizational change. She is deeply involved in the firm IP development on the future of work and co-lead BCG's Dexless Worker topic. Julia is the co-author of The Decision Maker's Playbook, published by the Financial Times in 2019. Her TED Talk on productive disagreement and constructive conversation have been viewed more than 8.5 million times. Welcome, Julia. We are very excited to have you joining the Human Advantage conference. Again, as this conversation with Julia is live, we will have the opportunity to ask her, after the conversation with Ted, a 10-minute session to ask direct questions to Julia. Ted?
Thank you. Well, Julia, I can't promise you 8.5 million today, but we have a good crowd here in Paris, and I know that we've had 2,700 people have registered. We've seen at least 1,600 online. We've had people from Singapore, Morocco, everybody, so we're glad to have you here. Julia, we all know BCG is one of the worldwide leaders in change and transformation, but I'd like you to tell us more. There's lots of different firms who work on change and transformation in different ways, but I want you to talk to us about your specific interest in using the learnings and methods of behavioral science for change and transformation. So, from your perspective, what is that role for BSci to transform organizations?
Let me start maybe with the frustration that motivated us to do and continue a lot of this work within BCG, with our clients out in the world, and may hope for the conversation that we will have today. Despite the fact that there has been thousands, perhaps millions of hours and millions of words spilled around how organizations should change and transform, the results are super disappointing. Really consistently, probabilistically, organizations don't successfully achieve the change results that they expect to at the start of a journey. When they start a large transformation, a small change initiative, the value that you might expect to get from a merger or an acquisition, what the market calls synergies. Sometimes, or some evidence says that up to 2/3 of transformations fail to achieve their intended objectives. And we think that's really outrageous. It's an appallingly low success rate. And part of that is because I think there is a lot of accepted wisdom around how we do change management in organizations. There's plenty of practice, but very little evidence, science, rigor. There's little commitment to a principles-based or an empirically informed approach to actually doing change management and then also to testing and experimenting in the context. What's special and different about how change happens, how work happens, by the way, in your organization that would allow us to shape a different approach. The second thing, and Tedrick, I wonder if you feel this as well, that we have actually done quite a good job. The behavioral science community has done a good job in helping the world decision makers reconceptualize human beings in different contexts. That as citizens or as participants in social processes, in political processes, we recognize that it is, human beings have difficulty making decisions, that we are slower, more biased, sometimes quicker in ways that are not helpful to make decisions. The world of consumer insights and marketing science has also recognized that when we're a customer, when I show up in a store or online, those frailties and vulnerabilities are always recognized. And yet, when you're an employee, like when I show up at work this morning and people don't do what we expect, they don't do what we hoped for, they don't even do what we asked for in the context of change or transformation, we say they didn't try hard enough. The solution here is that people should just work harder, or we clearly need a much stronger set of financial incentives. The chief executives are very quick to say in the private sector, oh, this is a problem with people's bonus. Like we just need to tie this to someone's annual performance bonus and the results will be different. No, they won't. Or it's very unlikely that they will, because we're not yet accounting for all of the wisdom that we have, the decades of wisdom that we might have the opportunity to pour into organizational transformation, organizational change. And very humbly stated, that's all that we are trying to do inside the behavioral science lab, is make sure that anytime that an organization embarks on a change, whether that change is large or small, that there's a basis of evidence to inform the way in which they practice that change. And ideally, there's a commitment to testing in context whether or not that wisdom, whether or not that received prescription actually applies in this specific situation with this specific set of constraints, such that organizations might be able to learn a little bit more about themselves every single time, so that they could also make systematically better decisions. Yeah. Though the long answer to your question, but you can tell I'm passionate about this idea that we can do a much better job. We can continue to incorporate much more knowledge, much more evidence, a much more diverse array of experts into the way in which change happens in boardrooms, executive teams, like in factories, on the front line of work.
Yeah. Coming from a consumer insights background myself before applying behavioral science, it took a long time on the consumer side. So I'm hoping that we can, on the corporate side, we can learn from how long it took us on the consumer side. Julia, you mentioned...
You're right. That's reassuring.
Right?
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. That comforts me too.
Well, you mentioned in a recent post on an article that I saw, you said the biggest lie in every transformation is that people like change. Can you elaborate on this a little bit, and what helps us against this aversion to change?
Yes. So there's, I think, a seductive thing that happens to CEOs, people of companies, executives at the beginning of a transformation or any type of large-scale change. So if you think about a transformation of a company might be moving from something to something. We might be moving from a regional business to a global business. We might be moving from a company that's very product-based to very customer-based. A large change might simply be we are moving our headquarters from Cincinnati to Boston, for instance. Anytime that you get a couple of rounds into this conversation, executives start to say, oh, we just need to remind people, we need to have a narrative to people that this change is really exciting. they've convinced themselves that it's really exciting. They want other people to be excited about it. And I think in the back of their minds, they have a sense that creating positive momentum will provide some fuel for the transformation to get done what they need to get done. And so it says, as long as people believe it's exciting, we're going to be just fine.
Yeah.
And here's the problem. People don't believe that. That it isn't true that in general, people find your change exciting. But actually the story gets a bit more complicated. So we actually set out to understand whether that hypothesis that we had, that people don't like change, that people are actually averse to change, was accurate. And it appears to be so in a whole range of settings. That in a situation where you offer people a change that is either objectively neutral, even accounting for the costs of changing, it's not painless to change, it's not free to change, or where a change is net positive, you know that person is strictly better off, people are still less likely, like they're more averse to change than they are attracted to the idea of changing. And all of us in this room are saying, yeah, of course, status quo bias. That, of course, that makes sense in the context of what we know about human beings. So that's problem number one. And we thought to ourselves at that point, having run a set of studies to validate this with several thousand people all over the world, thought, okay, now that we know that, that's a helpful starting point for organizations. We could actually just start saying to people, we're starting a few steps behind the start line than we realize. We're actually going to have to do more work to overcome that aversion, to reinforce the value of the change, to help people compress their time horizon so you can see the benefit of the future in the present, so on and so forth. There's a set of behavioral techniques that are going to help us to do that. But then enter problem number two. We said, but all types of people the same type of people? Is everyone going to experience this in the same way? Surprise twist. Of course not. Different types of people are different, and they're different in different ways. And one of the things that we found was when we run that study, most people respond fairly consistently. They're fairly consistently change averse. Holds across nationalities, tenures at work, people's level of education, gender identity, so on and so forth. Except for one very special group. And that very special group is senior executives. Not only are they not change averse, they are actually change seeking. They're almost addicted to change. They love change. They want other people to love change as much as they do. And so you imagine this dilemma that you've got this kind of biggest lie of transformation that people like change. But the people who are telling this lie don't think it's a lie at all. They do love change. Yeah. And so now the question is, well, what are we going to do about that? How are we going to use behavioral science both to do what I described and help people actually move not only towards the start line, but the finish line? Super important so that organizations can do what needs to get done. But number two, what's the behavioral work for these executives? How do we make clear and continue to bring mindfulness into that discussion, into those meetings, that not everyone experiences change in the way that you do. It's actually unlikely that they are going to, unless and until potentially they have a role like yours. And that's not a reasonable expectation. Mm-hmm. And so if you start out by saying, all I've got to do here, my only mission is to get these other people excited, our hunch is that you are already setting up whatever change you want to cause to fail. But there's a whole set of things you could be doing much earlier, much better, much more cheaply, I think, by the way, that would make the odds of success much more probable.
And I mean, so you have two cohorts, right? You have leaders who are seeking change and motivated for change and probably more incentivized by the change being successful. And then you have the larger cohort of employees who are averse to change, no fault of their own, and haven't been bought in on the motivation as early. So any kind of hot tips, Julia, on how do you bridge that really big gap? It's difficult to walk into a C-suite and tell everyone, cool your jets, calm down, be patient.
Chill out, everybody.
Right? And also hard to light the fire under potentially hundreds or thousands of global employees. So any hot tips on kind of practical ways to pull that gap together?
I don't know if I have a hot tip, but we do have a hypothesis, and we're actually working on a paper at the moment that we expect to finalize this week around what are potential explanations for this phenomenon that we call change distance. And I think one really compelling explanation, it requires further work, and that's some of the work that we are going to do this year, is that for leaders, change is the decision. I decide to buy the company. I decide to sell the company. I decide to make this shift. And the execution, the hard work of doing the change, not that it doesn't register, people are sophisticated and thoughtful, but it is not, it's just not cognitively as prominent as it is for the people who will have to do the change. So I get this, as an executive, I get this early, emotional, endorphin rush of having made the decision. I say, we've done the change. No wonder it's so satisfying for me. It seems like a very pleasurable thing to be able to do. And at the same time, employees in the organization hear that, and all they can see is a long, maybe endless journey ahead of execution, reporting, risks, issues that have to be managed.
And just changes to my day-to-day.
We see it totally differently. We're talking about two different kinds of problems, and we need to try to help one side understand the other, the two different types of problems we're solving.
Yeah. Regarding that application of behavioral science, I'm sure you've probably read Michael Hallworth has recently published a manifesto answering some criticisms that have emerged alongside the growing success of applied behavioral science, and also suggested kind of 10 proposals to ensure that applied BSci can fulfill its potential. A couple questions for you, Julia. First, I'd like to have your perspective regarding that challenge of BSci interventions to really reach scale in organizations. You work with big global companies and teams. How do you ensure that interventions scale, would be my first question. And then also there's a question around the right and ethical use of behavioral science. I always kind of make the joke, although I mean it. When you worship at the Church of Behavioral Science, you can see how powerful it is. You can see how it can be applied everywhere. But that also means you have to be careful about where you apply it. So I guess my question is first on scale and two on ethics.
Gosh, I love this set of proposals so much, by the way, and I'm so appreciative for the conversation that it's triggered as well around where applied behavioral science goes as a discipline and as a practice, and what are the issues that as a field have to be attended to urgently and over the coming years. Scale. How do we get to scale? And some of you in the room are saying, scale, I can't even get an organization into a pilot. I'm a ways away from scaling. In my experience, one of the ways to get to scale in large organizations is to plan for scale from the outset. So you might end up with a set of interventions that is more humble than you would have liked, is less intensive in terms of the resources, but that it could really consistently be deployed across the entire organization with relatively minimal investment, for example, minimal ongoing technology support. And I'll talk about one complication with that. But the perfect example is think about a frontline context, like a factory, a store, a call center. We actually have really good knowledge about what improves the quality of that job for people, like what makes that a more dignified, more equitable, more meaningful job beyond good quality pay and benefits. and it's the experience that you have from your supervisor. And so being able to consistently train and then nudge supervisors to practice what's called in the field situational leadership. Recognize what's going on, interpret the situation, help generate a constructive solution, create accountability for that constructive solution. When supervisors can do that consistently and well, that's one of the single biggest behavioral interventions you can use to upgrade the satisfaction of everyone inside an organization. And it's a good example of something that you might test in one place, you might test it in one factory, and then could relatively quickly standardize and scale it across an organization.
Great.
I think the dilemma, which is still unsolved, there are some technology solutions, but it is still highly imperfect, is how you create consistent accountability for these for successful interventions.
Yep.
And that's different from were we able to run a pilot with consistent, good quality measuring, monitoring, and evaluation that gave us the conviction to scale. It's actually, how are we going to, if we are so convicted about the importance of this, we also need to have the right set of accountability in the organization to check that it's happening on a daily basis or whatever the appropriate time horizon is. Part number 2, what are we doing about making sure that there is both ethical practice of behavioral science inside organizations, and there's also a really responsible license to operate, that we are empowering as many people as we possibly can with information that will help them bring a behaviorally informed approach to their decision making, but also a responsible behaviorally informed approach. Ted, Eric, I'm so curious for your view on this. My starting point is to say, in any of these situations, it's incredibly important to introduce third-party accountability. It's incredibly important to have a moment for review and to have that as part of what in the corporate world we talk about as project stage gating, like before a project can move from one place to another.
Yeah, we use some frameworks to kind of assess the brief and then think about spillover effects and all that kind of stuff.
Exactly.
I'm keeping an eye on the questions. I see one coming in for you, Julia. This one comes from Eddie, and his question is, a recurring challenge we face is showing clear ROI in a change program. How to set practical measures of success that can actually be measured and evaluated, especially financially, of course. Any thoughts on that, on how to kind of set some practical measures to see if there is ROI on a change program?
Eddie, it's such a great question. And maybe you have the experience that I have, that people say, change management, it's important, it's very important, we've got to do it. And you can tell that what people are thinking in the back of their minds, but not, sometimes they're too polite to say it, sometimes they do say it, is that this is a cost. Like, this is a cost for the program, and we've got to do it. Like, this lady is here telling us we've got to do it. So we will do it, but we're a little grudging about it. I think I have so far thought about that less around the measures, although I do think those are incredibly important. And I have some suggestions about how to tackle that, but much more about the narrative. And so I think the first problem is change management is a terrible brand, like a terrible word for what we are actually trying to do. And we're actually trying to come up with new ways in which we might brand and frame exactly that same set of activities. I think the more that we can begin to talk about it as an insurance policy towards achieving your goals, and that's the collective goals of the organization, the more I think people generate a different conception of it. People have no problem saying it's very important that we have insurance in a particular situation. And if change management and good quality change management, disciplined, and well-evidenced change management can start to feel like an insurance policy, I think that changes the conversation. The other way in which we have recently started to talk about it with some of our colleagues, clients, partners, is that this is a means to secure performance. Same kind of idea, slightly different narrative frame. We're trying to secure performance of the organization. We're not just here to manage you through the change and make sure it's not too bad, and then eventually you're on the other side and then the change management people will go away. What we're trying to do is build either a capability, a human capability, a technology capability, an organization capability to secure performance inside the organization.
Okay.
And then I think people probably know what my answer is on how do we create an ROI, and that is building the business case early on for robust or relatively robust, depending on the context in which you find yourself, testing of specific interventions that make up part of your program, that add together to be the program. A really good example from a program that we have at the moment, which is around digital adoption, and it's digital adoption of a specific new tool and technology. We have to train people on it. There is a hypothesis, and I think a strong conviction, maybe an emotional conviction from a lot of us, that an important component of that is in-person training with colleagues, with other people who do a similar job. And so that's part of our pilot approach. However, it's not cheap to do that. It's not necessarily quote unquote efficient to do that. So we are also piloting what does a fully virtual version of that curriculum actually look like. You immediately know the dollar value difference between doing the two of those things. And as soon as you're actually evaluating people for performance, you're testing for understanding, at the end of those, you pretty quickly have a view, not only on efficiency, but also on effectiveness that would allow you to then have that ROI discussion.
Great. Another question that's come through on the chat for you, Julie. This one comes from Ayush, and he says, could you talk about the general trend around monetary incentivization for change adoption in organizations as compared with non-monetary intervention?
Ayush, I could talk about this all day, but we don't have all day because I know we've got to keep the Human Advantage Conference moving. I think we have actually moved very little in the last half century, maybe longer, in terms of how we talk about and think about employee motivations in the context of organizational change. That very often the default assumption when we say that this is going to be a difficult change, it's going to require incremental work from people, is, and in the private sector, should there be a special bonus, right? Or should we link this to people's variable compensation over the short term or the long term? And I think that's a very reasonable conversation to have in a world where you've chosen to pay bonuses, you've chosen to variabilize people's comp, variabilizing it against a set of objectives that you want to achieve, tied to specific things that individuals can do to achieve those outcomes. Mm-hmm. Super reasonable thing to do. However, I think it rather misses the point around what actually might motivate, incentivize, and energize people to continue to participate, continue to contribute in a change effort like that. And again, I wonder if it's because we are asking the wrong question. And so the incentives question is, how do we make people do this? Mm-hmm. And if we instead said, here's the problem that we have. Here's our belief about what the solution is. You might have more evidence at that point and be able to say, here's our hypothesis about what the solution is. How would we build energy for moving towards this solution in the organization? So instead of saying, how do we manage for the change? How do we create change energy inside the organization? How do we actually create enough positive momentum to overcome that aversion, to overcome that inertia? And I think that will necessarily involve a different set of incentives, financial and non-financial, a different set of engagement and recognition for people inside the organization. But it's suddenly a totally different conversation. Yeah. One more punctuation point on this. We actually ran this study a few months ago where we said, to try and get underneath exactly this problem, we said, if you're going through a lot of change in your organization, what do you need right now? Well, you can make a whole set of requests to leadership. You can have more resources and you can hire more people, you can get new technology, you yourself could receive more training, or you could have more appreciation and recognition from your leaders. And independent of performance, independent of how much change they're going through, the number one thing that people want, nearly 2/3 of people say that this is their number one thing, is more appreciation and recognition from their leaders. So before you go out and think about, well, what are the financial incentives going to be and what might the construct be for points to have people participate, maybe I think it's worth spending 20 minutes to say, why don't we train leaders in our organization to praise and thank people well and consistently, and set an expectation that that is the job of a leader, to build energy through appreciation.
Great. I see the time ticking down, Julie. I know we missed one question that was in the chat. We'll maybe try to send it to you later. Thank you so much. This was it's clearly a topic people are quite passionate about. Thank you so much. And thank you for dialing in from Boston. I hope it's not too early for you. We've had people from all over the world today. But thanks so much for joining us, and we hope to keep the conversation going.
It's never too early to talk behavioral science. Have a lovely afternoon, everybody.
Great. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Julia.
Have a good one. See you.